They came in the dead hours when even the Hive's eternal thrum seemed to hold its mechanical breath. I remember the hammering on the rusted door of my hab cell, the shriek of corroded metal as it was torn from its hinges, and then the hands rough, unyielding, encased in worn carapace armor that stank of old sweat and gun oil. I never saw their faces. The enforcers wore masks, blank and expressionless as the Emperor's judgment, their eye lenses reflecting nothing but the dim phosphor strips that barely kept our level from total darkness. They said nothing as they dragged me into the corridor, my bare feet scraping across riveted deck plates still warm from the day cycle's heat. Around me, other doors remained closed. My neighbors knew better than to look, better than to question, better than to remember that I had ever existed at all. The promethium stink hit me first as they hauled me down through the Hive's lower reaches, through access corridors that grew narrower and more ancient with each descending level. The walls wept, condensation, and something worse, industrial runoff that had seeped through the Hive's infrastructure for millennia, leaving rust-colored stains like dried blood. My captor's boots echoed in perfect rhythm, a death march that resonated through the metallic bones of this colossal structure. I tried to speak, to ask what I had done, what law I had broken, but a gauntleted fist to my jaw taught me the first lesson of my new existence. Slaves have no voice, no rights to explanation, no claim to the mercy of understanding. We descended for what felt like hours, past levels I had never known existed, through checkpoints manned by guards who looked through me as though I were already a ghost. The air grew thick and hot, heavy with the stench of unwashed bodies, excrement, and the acrid tang of chemicals, whose names I would never know. I heard them before I saw them, the labor pits, vast caverns carved from the living rock beneath the Hive's foundation, where the Empire's insatiable hunger for resources was fed by the grinding machinery of human suffering. Thousands toiled in the half-light, moving like ants through a nest of conveyor systems and ore-crushing mechanisms that had been old when my grandfather's grandfather was born. The enforcers threw me before an overseer, a man whose augmetic eyes glowed a sickly green in the dimness. He regarded me with the dispassion of a butcher, examining cattle, then consulted a data slate with fingers that clicked and whirred cheap mechanical replacements that spoke of a life spent in service to the administratum's endless bureaucracy. Without ceremony, he seized my arm and pressed a branding tool to my flesh. The pain was immediate and absolute, white-hot agony that drove me to my knees as the acrid smell of my own burning skin filled my nostrils. When he released me, I saw it through tear-blurred eyes. A labor code, a string of numbers and letters that would define me for whatever remained of my existence. My name was gone. I was now laborer designate 4847 Theta 6, property of the Imperium. Blessed be his name. The Vox speakers crackled to life, and a voice distorted, inhuman, cruel barked orders that echoed through the pit. Work quotas, shift schedules, punishment protocols. The words blurred together into a liturgy of oppression, a catechism of servitude that would become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. I was assigned to a crew of 24 others, their faces hollow, their eyes already dead. They moved with the mechanical precision of servitors, but worse, they retained enough humanity to suffer, to know what they had lost, to remember that they had once been free. The first shift began immediately. There was no rest for the newly inducted, no period of adjustment or training. I was given a mono spade, its edge worn from decades of use, and pointed toward a seam of ore-bearing rock. Around me, the machinery roared and clattered, a symphony of industrial violence that never ceased, never paused, never showed mercy to those who served it. My hands, blistered within the first hour, bled within the second. By the end of what I would later learn was a 16-hour shift, I could barely feel them at all. The overseers moved among us like predators, their shock whips coiled at their belts. their eyes constantly scanning for signs of weakness or defiance. I witnessed my first execution before the shift ended, a man who had collapsed from exhaustion, his body simply giving out beneath the weight of impossible demands. The overseer didn't even break stride as he drew his stub pistol and fired a single round into the man's skull. The body was dragged away by servitors, mechanical corpses that had once been human, hauled toward what other workers whispered were the reprocessing vats. Even in death, the Imperium found use for its slaves. As I collapsed onto the stone floor that would serve as my bed, my body screaming in agony, my hands ruined, my spirit already beginning to crack, I clung to one thought that I believed might sustain me. Surely this could not last forever. Surely death would come, if not as rescue then as release, a final mercy that would end this nightmare. I did not yet understand the truth that would become apparent in the days and months to come, that death was not a release the Imperium granted lightly, that my suffering had only just begun, and that in the darkness beneath the hive, hope itself was the cruelest lie of all. The machines never slept, and so neither did we. The concept of day and night became meaningless in the perpetual twilight of the labor pits, measured only by the shift bells that rang with the regularity of a mechanical heart. I learned to move in the half-conscious state of the truly exhausted, my body performing its tasks, while my mind retreated to some distant place, where pain was merely a dull echo. The ore moved through us, an endless stream of the hive's lifeblood that we extracted with broken hands and shattered spirits, feeding it into conveyor systems that stretched into darkness, carrying our labor toward purposes we would never know, and benefits we would never see. The shock whips sang their hymns of punishment with terrible regularity. The overseers wielded them with the practiced ease of long experience, the crackling energy lashes splitting the air with sounds like the tearing of reality itself. I learned their rhythm, learned to anticipate the strikes by reading the subtle shifts in an overseer's posture, the way their grip tightened on the haft before the blow fell. The first time the lash caught me, I screamed a raw, animal sound that echoed through the pit and brought cruel laughter from my tormentors. The pain was unlike anything I had known, electricity coursing through my nervous system, every muscle contracting in sympathetic agony, my vision whiting out as my body convulsed beyond my control. After that first taste, I learned to be more careful, to work harder, to never give them cause to notice me. But the whips fell regardless, for the overseers needed no reason beyond their own amusement or the simple maintenance of terror. Some slaves were beaten for working too slowly, others for working too quickly, for making their fellows look inadequate by comparison. Still others were beaten for no reason at all, selected at random as object lessons in the absolute power our masters held over us. I witnessed strong men reduced to weeping children beneath the lash, watched as proud souls were broken and reformed into perfect instruments of obedience. Between the strikes, we were made to pray. The overseers, in their twisted piety, believed that labor without devotion was heresy, that our suffering must be offered up as prayer to the God Emperor of mankind. They taught us the litanies, barking the words over the vox speakers, forcing us to repeat them as we worked. The Emperor protects, we chanted, though no protection came. Blessed is the mind too small for doubt, we recited, as doubt ate at our souls like acid. Innocence proves nothing, we proclaimed, though we were guilty of nothing save being born in the wrong place at the wrong time. I learned to mouth the Emperor's name between blows, speaking the prayers with lips that had forgotten how to smile, with a tongue thick and dry from dehydration and chemical-tainted air. The words became automatic, meaningless, a shield of ritual that I hoped might deflect the worst of the overseer's attention. Did the Emperor hear us in those depths? Could his light penetrate so far beneath the hive's blessed surface? I doubted, and the doubt was its own special torment, for I had been raised to believe in his divine protection, his infinite mercy. Yet here, in this pit of suffering, There was no evidence of either. The air itself was our constant enemy, thick with particulates that turned our lungs black and our coughs bloody. We breathed in the dust of groundstone, the fumes of chemical processes I couldn't name, the smoke from machinery that burned with fuel types forbidden on the upper levels. Every breath was an act of slow suicide, a gradual poisoning that would claim us all eventually, even if the whips and bullets and crushing machinery did not find us first. I saw men cough their lungs out onto the stone floor, saw them drown in their own blood, while overseers stepped over their convulsing bodies without a second glance. Those who faltered, who could no longer maintain the brutal pace demanded of us, were not granted the mercy of death. They were dragged away by servitors, mechanical corpses whose vacant eyes held echoes of the humanity they had once possessed. We whispered about where they went, though none of us truly wanted to know. The reprocessing vats, some said massive containers where failed slaves were rendered down into their constituent elements, their organic components recycled into nutrient paste, their bones ground into industrial grit. Others spoke of the servitor factories, where living brains were cut from skulls and imprisoned in mechanical shells, doomed to an eternity of mindless service. No one ever returned to tell us which rumors were true. I worked beside a man named Corvin, or at least that was what he whispered he had been called before. He had been in the pits for 3 years, he claimed, though he looked ancient, his skin the color of old leather, his eyes yellow from chemical exposure. He taught me the small survivals, how to pace oneself to last the full shift, where to position oneself to avoid the overseer's attention, which servitors to avoid because their faulty programming made them dangerous. He showed me his hands, the flesh worn down to expose bone in places, wrapped in rags that had once been part of his prisoner's uniform. "You still hope," he said to me one shift, his voice barely audible over the roar of machinery. "I can see it in your eyes. Stop. Hope is what kills you here. Accept that you're already dead, and the rest becomes easier." I couldn't accept his wisdom then. Some part of me still believed in release, whether through escape or death or some imperial audit that might discover us and deem our treatment excessive. I prayed to the Emperor, genuinely prayed, not just mouthed the words. I begged for deliverance, for justice, for an end to suffering. The prayers echoed in my skull, unanswered, while the machinery roared and the whips sang, and my body slowly broke beneath the weight of endless labor. The shifts blurred together into an eternal present of pain and exhaustion, punctuated only by brief collapses into unconsciousness that served as sleep. I lost count of the days, lost track of how long I had been in the darkness. Time became measured only in suffering the pain of a fresh whip strike, the agony of muscles pushed past all reasonable limits, the slow burn of starvation as we were fed just enough nutrient paste to keep us functional but never sated. My body became a map of injuries, new hurts layering over old, creating a comprehensive geography of torment that I carried with me into each shift. And through it all, the litanies. The Emperor protects. In the darkness, we serve. Pain is the cleanser. Words that had once held meaning in my old life, before the enforcers came, now hollow as the skulls that decorated the Hive's upper reaches. I spoke them anyway, because to stop was to invite the lash, and I had learned that there were always new depths of suffering to be discovered, always worse torments waiting for those who showed defiance. So I prayed to a God who did not answer, in a pit where light was a myth, and hope had become the cruelest heresy of all. The transfer came without warning, as all things did in this existence where we possessed neither rights nor voice. The ore seams had run dry, depleted after uncounted years of exploitation, and the administratum in its infinite bureaucracy had determined that our labor was needed elsewhere. We were herded onto cargo lifters, massive platforms designed to haul equipment and materials, pressed together so tightly that we could barely breathe, and hauled upward through the Hive's infrastructure. As we rose through level after level, I caught glimpses of life beyond the pit's workers, in relatively clean uniforms, hab blocks with functioning illumination, even the distant suggestion of sky, though I knew it would be nothing more than the Hive's upper atmosphere, choked with industrial effluent and blocked by the endless sprawl of construction. The manufactorum waited for us like the maw of some immense beast. It spread across an entire level of the Hive, a vast cathedral of industry where furnaces burned with the intensity of captured stars and machinery, the size of buildings, performed tasks beyond my comprehension. The heat hit us before we even entered, a wall of scorching air that made the labor pits seem almost comfortable by comparison. As the overseers drove us forward with shock prods and barked commands, I saw what would be our new existence, rows of furnaces stretching into the distance, each one a glowing heart of terrible purpose, tended by workers who moved like the damned through the circles of some industrial hell. We were assigned to the slag processing lines, where molten metal waste was sorted and reclaimed, where every moment brought the possibility of horrible death or maiming. I worked beside other husks of humanity, people worn down to their most basic functions, eyes hollow and staring, hands wrapped in makeshift protections that did little against the constant exposure to extreme heat and toxic substances. The servitors moved among us, and I understood now why Corvin had warned me to avoid them. They were reminders of our ultimate fate. Mechanical corpses with just enough organic tissue remaining to be called human, their brains imprisoned in metal shells, doomed to an eternity of mindless labor. I envied them. Emperor, forgive me. I envied their silence, the blessed emptiness that seemed to fill the space where their humanity had once resided. They felt no pain, harbored no hope, suffered no despair. They simply existed, performed their functions, and moved on to the next task with the perfect obedience of the machine. To become a servitor, I began to believe, might be a kind of mercy, a transformation that would strip away the consciousness that made suffering meaningful, that would reduce me to pure function without the burden of awareness. The work was brutal in ways the labor pits had never been. In the pits, the danger was slow, the gradual accumulation of damage, the erosion of the body through endless labor and chemical exposure. Here, death stalked us with every shift, immediate and terrible. I watched men consumed by molten slag when a crucible tipped, saw their bodies flash into flame and ash in seconds, their screams cut short by the sheer intensity of the heat. I saw limbs severed by industrial machinery, workers pulled into gears and crushers, bodies broken and mangled by equipment that had been designed with no consideration for the fragility of human flesh. The oils and chemicals we worked with stained our skin, penetrated our pores, entered our bloodstreams, and began their slow work of transformation. My hands became slick and raw, the flesh constantly weeping from burns and chemical exposure, healing only to be damaged again. My lungs, already compromised from my time in the pits, now labored with every breath, the air thick with metallic particles and toxic fumes that turned our sputum black and our coughs productive with blood. Some workers' eyes turned strange colors, yellows and greens that spoke of systemic poisoning, of bodies slowly breaking down beneath the assault of substances never meant to mingle with human biology. Every waking moment became a prayer for numbness, a desperate plea for some mercy that might dull the constant assault on my senses. But pain, I learned, was the only grace left to remind me I still existed, still retained some core of humanity that could register suffering. The day I stopped feeling the burns would be the day I had truly died, even if my body continued to move through the motions of labor. So I embraced the pain, made it my prayer, my meditation, my connection to the reality that I had not yet been fully consumed by the machinery of the Imperium. The overseers here were different from those in the pits, more sophisticated in their cruelty, more educated in the arts of maintaining productivity through precise application of terror. They wore better armor, carried better weapons, and spoke with the authority of those who had studied the mechanisms of human motivation in the administratum's academies. They knew exactly how much suffering we could endure before becoming useless, knew how to pace the beatings and executions to maintain optimal fear without triggering the kind of desperation that led to rebellion. They were artists of oppression, and we were their canvas. The servitors fascinated and terrified me in equal measure. I began to study them during the brief moments when supervision was lax, watching how they moved, how they interacted with the machinery, how they performed their tasks with absolute precision and zero initiative. I saw brands on their metal chassis designations from regiments, manufactorums, even noble houses. Each one had been a person once, with a name and a history and dreams that had been surgically extracted and discarded. Some retained odd remnants of their former selves, a servitor that hummed tunelessly while it worked, another that flinched from sudden movements, as though some deep instinct still remembered fear. I worked beside a woman whose name I never learned, who had been in the manufactorum for longer than she could remember. Her hair had burned away in patches, her scalp scarred from splashes of molten metal, her face a roadmap of old injuries that had healed badly or not at all. She spoke rarely, and when she did, it was always the same thing. Another shift survived is another gift from the Emperor. She believed it, truly believed that our suffering was service, that our pain was prayer, that we were blessed to be given the opportunity to labor for the glory of the Imperium. Her faith horrified me more than any overseer's cruelty, for it represented the final victory of our oppression, the moment when the slave learned to love their chains. The furnaces glowed like dying stars, and we tended them with the devotion of mad priests, feeding them materials and blood in equal measure. The heat was so intense that standing too close could burn flesh through clothing, could cause the moisture in one's eyes to evaporate, leaving them dry and painful. Yet we worked on, shift after shift, our bodies slowly cooking from the inside out, our flesh gradually taking on the quality of meat left too long over flame. Some workers simply collapsed, their hearts giving out from the heat stress, their bodies unable to regulate temperature in an environment that mocked all biological norms. My every waking moment became dominated by the fires, their roar filling my ears until I could hear nothing else, their light burning itself into my retinas until I saw them even when I closed my eyes. I dreamed of coolness, of water, of relief that never came. I prayed for numbness with every fiber of my being, begged whatever gods might listen to strip away my capacity for sensation. But the pain remained, constant and faithful, the only companion I could rely upon in this hell of industry and flame. And through it all, the servitors moved in their silent procession, reminders of what awaited those who could no longer serve in their current form. I watched them, and wondered when my turn would come, when I would feel the cold kiss of surgical implements, and wake to find my consciousness imprisoned in a shell of metal, doomed to an eternity of service, without the sweet release of true death. In the darkness between shifts, when exhaustion pulled me down into something that could barely be called sleep, I sometimes hoped that moment would come soon. They descended like the Emperor's wrath made manifest, black-armored and terrible, their carapace gleaming in the furnace light like the shells of enormous beetles. The Adeptus Arbites came without warning, their arrival announced only by the sudden silence of the Vox speakers and the immediate terror that gripped every overseer on the floor. We slaves knew something was wrong by the way our masters reacted, the way they straightened their uniforms and checked their weapons, the way fear flickered across faces that had shown us nothing but contempt and cruelty for months or years. The Arbites moved through the manufactorum with the unstoppable precision of a killing machine, their riot shields locked together, their combat shotguns held ready, their helmets reflecting nothing but our own terrified faces back at us. None of them spoke. They communicated through hand signals and encrypted Vox channels, a silent brotherhood of law enforcement that needed no words to coordinate their terrible purpose. We pressed ourselves against walls and machinery, trying to become invisible, trying to escape the attention of these avatars of imperial justice who saw us as nothing more than potential criminals awaiting judgment. The Vox speakers crackled back to life, and a voice, cold, mechanical, utterly devoid of mercy, declared that information had reached the local precinct fortress regarding seditious whispers within the manufactorum. Rumors, they said, of workers speaking against the God Emperor, of malcontent spreading dissent, of the foul corruption of heretical thought taking root in the minds of those who should know nothing but grateful service. The punishment for such crimes was death, they reminded us, as though any of us could have forgotten, as though the skulls that decorated every corner of the Hive were not reminder enough of the Imperium's intolerance for deviation. The beatings began immediately and without discrimination. The Arbites moved through our ranks like harvesters through grain, their shock moles rising and falling with rhythmic brutality, their armored fists breaking bones and crushing flesh with the casual efficiency of long practice. They pulled workers from the lines at random, slamming them against machinery, demanding confessions to crimes that may or may not have been committed, extracting names and accusations through methods that made our overseer's cruelty seem almost gentle by comparison. I watched a man I had worked beside for weeks, dragged before an Arbite's judge, a towering figure in black armor who carried the weight of imperial law like a weapon. The worker pleaded innocence, swore oaths of loyalty to the Emperor, wept and begged for mercy. The judge listened in silence, his helmeted head tilted slightly, then delivered his verdict with a single word: guilty. The execution was immediate. A bolt pistol pressed to the man's forehead, a trigger pulled, and his head exploded in a shower of bone fragments and brain matter that painted the floor in a spreading pool of red. The body was left where it fell as an example, a warning, a reminder of what awaited those who harbored thoughts of dissent. The violence escalated. The Arbites were thorough in their investigation, which meant that everyone was suspect. Every worker, a potential heretic who needed to be questioned, tested, and frequently executed. They beat the life from a dozen workers before the Vox even declared order restored, their methods brutal and unapologetic. I saw friends, what I had dared to call friends in this place, where friendship was a luxury none of us could afford, shot through the head for crimes as nebulous as suspicious behavior or inadequate enthusiasm in prayer. I saw one man executed for whispering about freedom, a word that was itself a kind of heresy in the Imperium. He had said it so quietly that I barely heard it myself, a desperate murmur spoken during a brief rest period when he thought no one was listening. But the Arbites had ears everywhere, informants among the workers, surveillance devices hidden in the machinery. They dragged him out before us all, forced him to his knees, and an Arbite's executioner, his armor decorated with skull motifs and purity seals, placed a combat shotgun against the man's skull and pulled the trigger. The detonation was tremendous, the man's head simply ceasing to exist in an explosion of blood and bone. His body remained kneeling for a moment, arterial spray fountaining from his neck, before it toppled forward. The stench of blood mingled with the burning grease and chemical fumes that always filled the manufactorum, creating an unholy perfume that made us gag and retch. But we dared not look away, dared not show weakness, for the Arbites were watching us, watching them, evaluating our reactions, searching for any sign of sympathy or horror that might mark us as fellow travelers with the supposed seditionists. So we stood and watched, and learned the lesson they were teaching. Obedience was not survival, only delay. Every one of us would die here eventually, whether by accident or execution or simple exhaustion. The only question was when. I learned something terrible in those hours, as the Arbites conducted their purge. I learned that there was always something worse waiting, always some new depth of suffering and terror that the Imperium could inflict upon those it deemed lesser. The overseers, for all their cruelty, at least needed us functional, needed us alive and able to work. The Arbites cared nothing for productivity, nothing for quotas or efficiency. They cared only for law, for order, for the absolute dominance of imperial authority. To them, killing half the workforce to root out potential heresy was not a failure but a success, a demonstration of their commitment to the Emperor's will. When the killing finally stopped, when the Arbites had extracted whatever confessions they deemed sufficient and executed whoever their investigation had marked for death, they simply left. No words of explanation, no declaration that the Manufactorum was now cleansed, no reassurance to the overseers or the surviving workers. They withdrew in the same terrible silence they had arrived with, their armored boots echoing on metal floors slick with blood, leaving behind dozens of corpses and hundreds of traumatized survivors who now understood the true meaning of imperial justice. The overseers ordered us back to work immediately. The bodies were dragged away, the blood was hosed down the reclamation drains, and the Manufactorum resumed its roar as though nothing had happened. But everything had changed. Before the Arbites came, I had still harbored some small hope that resistance might be possible, that if enough of us rose up together we might overwhelm our masters and win some measure of freedom. Now I understood the foolishness of such thoughts. The Imperium's power was absolute and terrible, backed by organizations like the Arbites, who would slaughter thousands without hesitation to maintain order. From that day, I stopped dreaming of escape. The fantasy that had sustained me through the worst of the labor pits and the fires of the Manufactorum finally died, killed as surely as if an Arbites had put a bolt round through its skull. I began instead to count the days by the number of corpses burned, finding a grim comfort in the mathematics of death. Each body sent to the reclamation furnaces was one less soul suffering in this hell, one more escape achieved through the only means available to us. I envied the dead their silence, their freedom from pain, their release from the endless cycle of labor and torment. The Emperor had not saved us. He had, instead, sent his enforcers to remind us of our place, to demonstrate through blood and brutality that we existed only to serve, that our lives meant nothing beyond our utility to the Imperium's endless hunger for production. Any dreams of justice, any hopes for mercy, any prayers for deliverance, all were revealed as the cruelest lies, fantasies that made our suffering worse by giving us false hope. The only truth was the one written in blood on the Manufactorum floor. Serve, suffer, and die. Those were our options, and even death was not guaranteed to be swift or clean. Number Chapter 5. The Heretic's Whisper. The voice came first through the ventilation tunnels, a sound so quiet and distant that for days I believed it was merely my mind beginning to fracture under the weight of accumulated trauma. But others heard it too. I saw them pause in their work, heads tilted as though straining to catch words buried beneath the roar of machinery. The overseers noticed nothing, or if they did, they attributed the workers' occasional distraction to exhaustion or chemical exposure. They could not hear what we heard, could not sense what we sensed, a presence reaching out through the darkness, calling to those who had been pushed beyond the limits of what the human soul was meant to endure. In the depths of the Manufactorum, where the ventilation systems branched into forgotten maintenance corridors and abandoned sections that predated the current structure by centuries, something had awakened. Or perhaps it had always been there, patient and eternal, waiting for the right moment to make itself known to those whose desperation had made them vulnerable. The voice whispered promises of deliverance, not through the God Emperor's grace. We had long since learned that grace would never come but through change. Terrible, glorious change that would transform us into something beyond suffering, beyond the reach of overseers and arbites, and all the crushing machinery of imperial oppression. I knew the punishment for listening. I had seen it in the Arbites' purge, had watched men die for less than heretical thoughts. To entertain ideas that contradicted imperial doctrine was to invite not merely death but damnation, the kind of ending where one's soul was forfeit along with one's body. Yet despair makes blasphemy sound like salvation. When every prayer to the emperor goes unanswered, when suffering is the only constant, and hope itself becomes a form of torture, the forbidden begins to seem not dangerous but sensible, not evil but merely pragmatic. I listened. Emperor, forgive me. I listened. We all did, in our own ways. During those precious moments when the overseer's attention wandered, or when we found ourselves assigned to maintenance tasks in the deeper sections of the manufactorum, the voice spoke in a language that was not quite language, ideas that bypassed the ear and planted themselves directly into the mind. It promised liberation through transformation, freedom through surrender to powers that existed beyond the Emperor's light, beyond the Imperium's crushing order. The air in the ventilation tunnels grew thick with something more than industrial pollution. A presence manifested there, invisible but palpable, like the pressure change before a storm. We began to gather there in small groups during rest periods, drawn by something we couldn't name and wouldn't have dared to speak aloud. The voice grew stronger, more coherent, painting visions in our minds of a world where we were not slaves but masters, where our suffering would be transformed into power, where the chains of imperial service would be shattered by forces that owed no allegiance to the Golden Throne. The whispers spoke of gods, not the God Emperor but other entities, beings of pure want and will that existed in a realm adjacent to our own. They promised strength to the weak, pleasure to those who knew only pain, knowledge to those kept ignorant, and endless change to those trapped in stagnation. The words were poison, I knew, corruption wrapped in promises designed to exploit our desperation. Yet knowing this did not make them less appealing. What did I have to lose? My freedom was already gone. My body was already broken. My soul, if the Emperor had ever cared for it, had been forfeit the moment the enforcers dragged me from my hab cell. Eyes began to glow faintly in the dark, an eerie luminescence that had no natural source. At first, I thought it was merely the reflection of furnace light or the bioluminescence of the strange fungi that grew in the damp places of the hive. But the glow persisted in complete darkness, a cold light that emanated from within, from the eyes of those who had listened too long and begun to accept what the voice offered. I saw it in others and wondered if they saw it in me, if my own eyes had begun to reflect the touch of whatever presence spoke to us from beyond. I felt something stir inside me, something that wasn't entirely mine. It was subtle at first, a presence at the edge of consciousness, a voice in the back of my mind that spoke with my own thoughts, but carried suggestions that seemed to come from elsewhere. My prayers to the Emperor began to ring hollow, the words feeling like lies even as I mouthed them. The litanies that the overseers forced us to recite became painful to speak, as though they were weapons turned against whatever was growing within me. The change was not just spiritual but physical. I began to notice alterations in my body, subtle at first, but gradually more pronounced. Burns that should have taken weeks to heal knitted themselves in days. Pain that should have been unbearable became strangely distant, as though happening to someone else. My strength increased, allowing me to work longer and harder than should have been possible given my depleted state. Other workers noticed too, we saw it in each other, the signs of transformation that we dared not speak of but could not hide. The overseers remained oblivious, or perhaps they had seen such things before and knew better than to investigate too closely. In the depths of a hive, where the Emperor's light barely penetrated, where the population numbered in the billions and individual souls meant nothing, who could say what strange mutations and developments might occur? As long as we maintained productivity, as long as we continued to serve, our masters seemed content to ignore the subtle changes occurring within their workforce. But we knew, in the darkness of the ventilation tunnels, where the voice spoke most clearly, we gathered and shared our experiences in hushed tones. Some claimed to see visions of a better world, a realm where suffering was transmuted into sensation and weakness into strength. Others spoke of dreams where entities of impossible geometry offered them gifts in exchange for their service. Still others simply reveled in the small powers they had, gained the ability to endure pain that should have killed them, to move with strength they had lost years ago, to think with clarity, despite the chemicals that should have reduced their minds to mush. I should have been terrified. I should have run to the nearest overseer, confessed everything, accepted whatever punishment they deemed appropriate for the crime of listening to heretical whispers. But terror requires the belief that things can get worse, and I had long since passed the point where I believed that possible. What could the Imperium do to me that it had not already done? Kill me? I prayed for death. Torture me? My entire existence was torture. Damn my soul? I had been damned the moment they branded my arm with a labor code and threw me into the pits. So I listened, and the voice grew stronger, and something inside me that had been broken began to knit itself back together in ways that were not entirely natural. I felt the presence growing, spreading through the workers like an infection, touching each of us and offering the same terrible bargain. Surrender to us, serve our purpose, and no power beyond the Emperor's dead hand. Some refused, clinging to their imperial faith despite everything. Others, like me, found themselves unable to resist, drawn by promises that seemed no worse than the reality we already endured. The air in the manufactorum changed, became charged with possibility and danger. Those of us who had accepted the whispers began to recognize each other, could sense the presence we shared like a scent on the wind. We moved differently, worked with a purpose beyond mere survival, and in our eyes burned that strange luminescence that marked us as something other than we had been. A transformation was coming, we could feel it, a moment when the whispers would become screams, and the promises would demand to be fulfilled. I knew it was heresy. I knew it was damnation. I knew that what I was becoming would make me an enemy of all mankind, a target for the Emperor's servants, a thing to be hunted and destroyed without mercy. And yet I could not stop, could not turn back, could not reject the only hope, false though it might be, that had been offered to me in all my months of suffering. The voice promised change, and change, any change, seemed better than an eternity of this hell. In the darkness between shifts, when exhaustion should have claimed me, I lay awake and felt the presence moving through my thoughts, reshaping me from within. I was becoming something new, something dangerous, something that the Imperium would rightfully fear. And for the first time since the enforcers took me from my hab cell, I felt something other than despair. What I felt was not quite hope. That word had become meaningless, but possibility. The possibility that this existence might end, that transformation might come, that the fires burning within me might consume everything I had been and forge something new from the ashes. The voice whispered on, and we listened, and the manufactorum grew thick with the presence of powers that should never have found purchase in the material realm. Something was coming, some moment of culmination when the whispers would demand action, and we would have to choose: remain slaves to the Emperor's Imperium, or become servants of something far older and infinitely more terrible. The heretic's words became fire in our veins, a conflagration that spread through the workforce like wildfire through promethium-soaked rags. The transformation that had been subtle and internal suddenly erupted into the material realm with terrible violence. It began during the shift change, that moment when thousands of workers moved through the manufactorum's corridors, and one of us, I never learned who struck the first blow, put his hands around an overseer's throat and simply refused to let go. The overseer's shock whip cracked and sparked, electricity coursing through the worker's body. But he did not release his grip. His fingers dug into flesh, crushed cartilage, and when the overseer finally fell, the worker stood over the body with eyes that burned with cold fire. That single act of defiance became the spark that ignited the powder keg of our accumulated rage. Years of suffering, months of torture, weeks of whispered promises from things beyond the veil, all of it came together in one explosive moment of violence that transformed the Manufactorum from industrial cathedral into charnel house. We rose as one, thousands of broken souls suddenly empowered by forces we barely understood, and we turned on our masters with the fury of the truly desperate. The slaves became a tide of flesh and fury that swept through the Manufactorum's levels like a wave of carnage. We tore down overseers with our bare hands, fingers strengthened by whatever dark blessing had touched us, bodies made resilient by powers that mocked the Imperium's understanding of human limitation. The shock whips that had been our torment became our trophies, seized from dying hands and turned against their former wielders with savage enthusiasm. Blood sprayed across machinery that had drunk only oil and coolant, painting the industrial equipment in new and terrible colors. Our screams were drowned by the alarms of the Hive, claxons wailing their warning that insurrection had come to the sacred Manufactorum, that the social order had been inverted, that slaves had dared to raise their hands against their betters. The sound was tremendous, a wall of noise that should have been terrifying but instead felt liberating, a declaration that we existed, that we mattered, that we would no longer accept our oppression in silence. We howled back at the alarms, our voices merging into a chorus of rage and release that echoed through the hab blocks and corridors. I felt the Emperor's gaze upon me, or perhaps it was another's, some entity that existed in the spaces between reality, watching our uprising with interest or amusement or hunger. The distinction ceased to matter in that moment of violence. I seized a tool spike, a length of sharpened metal used to clear blockages in the furnace feeds, and I ran toward an Arbite who had emerged from the security station, his combat shotgun raised. His first shot took a worker beside me, the man's chest exploding in a shower of blood and bone fragments. His second shot I somehow avoided, my body moving with a speed and grace that should have been impossible for someone in my depleted state. I plunged my tool spike into the narrow gap between his helmet and chestplate, felt it pierce the soft tissue of his throat, and pushed with all the strength that dark powers had granted me. The Arbite made a choking sound, his hands dropping his shotgun to claw at his neck, but I held the spike firm and watched the life drain from his eyes behind the helmet's visor. Blood steamed on the metal floor, hot and viscous, and for one glorious moment I thought we were free. For one perfect instant, I believed that we had broken our chains, that we would overthrow our masters and claim the Manufactorum as our own, that the future might hold something other than suffering and death. The violence escalated beyond anything I could have imagined. Servitors were torn apart, their mechanical components ripped free in showers of sparks and hydraulic fluid, their organic parts revealed in all their pathetic horror brains, floating in nutrient tanks, eyes staring sightlessly from preserved skulls, mouths frozen in expressions that might have been screams. Machinery was smashed, furnaces were left to run wild without supervision, chemical containers were breached, and their contents allowed to spill across the floor in toxic floods that burned flesh and metal alike. We fought with the desperation of those who knew there could be no surrender, no mercy, no return to our former existence. The overseers who had tormented us for so long became our prey, hunted through the corridors they had once patrolled with such arrogance. We showed them the same mercy they had shown us, which is to say, none at all. We beat them to death with their own shock mauls, shot them with their own stub pistols, threw them into the furnaces they had forced us to tend, and listened to their screams as they burned. Some workers wept as they killed, tears streaming down faces twisted with rage and sorrow. Others laughed, a sound more terrifying than any scream, the laughter of madness and release. Still others worked in grim silence, methodical in their violence, treating the execution of our former masters as just another task to be completed with efficiency. I fell somewhere between all these extremes, my mind fractured by the whiplash of transformation from victim to killer, unable to process the enormity of what we were doing but unable to stop. The presence I had felt growing within me swelled to fill my entire being, and for moments at a time I was not myself but a vessel for something else, something that rejoiced in the violence and chaos we were creating. I saw through my own eyes as though from a distance, watched my hands commit acts of brutality that should have horrified me, but instead filled me with savage satisfaction. The boundaries between myself and the entity that had whispered to us blurred, and I could not say where I ended and it began. Then came the thunder from above, a sound like the judgment of gods, and I looked up to see the ceiling of the manufactorum crack and split. The orbital bombardment had begun, the Imperium's response to insurrection swift and absolute. They would not send soldiers to retake the manufactorum, would not negotiate or attempt to understand what had driven us to rebellion. They would simply destroy it all, reduce the entire structure to rubble and slag, bury our uprising beneath megatons of debris, and forget we had ever existed. The light of fire from above penetrated through the breached ceiling, and in that terrible illumination I saw the truth of what we had become. The workers around me were no longer entirely human. Their flesh had warped and changed, growing strange protrusions, taking on unnatural colors, reorganizing itself into configurations that defied biological possibility. Some had too many eyes, others too many limbs. Still others had become amalgamations of flesh and the machinery they had worked with. Metal and meat fused in unions that should have been impossible. I looked down at my own hands and saw that they too had changed. The fingers elongated, the nails become claws, the skin taking on a texture like scales or chitin. The tool spike I held had merged partially with my palm, metal and flesh becoming one, in a way that was both revolting and strangely right. I was becoming something other than human. Transformation, accelerated by the violence and the presence that had granted us the strength to rise against our oppressors. The bombardment intensified, massive shells falling from orbit, each one carrying enough explosive force to level entire blocks. The manufactorum shook with each impact, walls crumbling, floors buckling, the carefully organized industrial space becoming a maze of rubble and twisted metal. Workers died by the hundreds, crushed beneath falling debris, incinerated by explosive blasts, buried alive in the wreckage of the machines they had once served. Our moment of freedom was being measured in seconds, our triumph already transforming into tragedy. I tried to run to find some shelter from the destruction raining down, but there was nowhere to go. The bombardment was absolute, designed not to capture or contain, but to obliterate. The Imperium had decided that the loss of the manufactorum was acceptable, that whatever production was sacrificed was worth it to ensure that our rebellion did not spread, that the disease of insurrection was cauterized with overwhelming force before it could infect the rest of the hive. In the chaos and fire, in the moments between one breath and the next, I understood that our uprising had been doomed from the start. The powers that had whispered to us had given us strength, yes, but not enough to challenge the Imperium's might. They had used us, drawn on our desperation to manifest in the material realm, and now they would abandon us to our fate. We had been tools, weapons in a game whose rules we could not comprehend, and now that we had served our purpose, we were being discarded with the same casual indifference our former masters had shown. A shell struck nearby, the blast wave picking me up and hurling me across the manufactorum floor like a child's toy. I crashed into something solid, felt bones break, tasted blood in my mouth. Through blurred vision, I saw the ceiling finally give way entirely, massive slabs of reinforced plasteel and rockcrete falling in a deadly rain. The last thing I saw before darkness claimed me was fire, fire falling from the sky, fire consuming everything, fire purging the manufactorum and everyone within it in the Emperor's terrible mercy. We had thought ourselves free, but we had merely exchanged one form of bondage for another, one set of masters for another, and in the end, both the Emperor and the Dark Powers had agreed on one thing, that we deserved only destruction, that our lives meant nothing, that our suffering was irrelevant to the vast and terrible machinery of the galaxy's endless conflicts. The purge came with the dawn, though in the depths of the Hive dawn was merely an abstraction, a concept borrowed from a world above where the sun still theoretically existed beyond the pollution and the hab blocks that stretched unto the horizon. I woke to the sound of hymns, voices raised in praise of the God Emperor, the words beautiful and terrible in their fervor. Through vision blurred by pain and debris, I saw them coming, the Ecclesiarchy's zealots, the Adepta Sororitas in their power armor, the flagellants and priests and faithful servants of the imperial creed, who had come to cleanse the manufactorum of the taint we had spread. They swept through the ruins with flamers held high, the blessed fire of purification turning everything it touched to ash and char. The hymns never ceased, a constant wall of sound that proclaimed the righteousness of their mission, the glory of their purpose, the eternal truth that heresy must be burned from the Imperium's body like an infection from flesh. Censers swung from chains, spreading clouds of sacred incense that mixed with the smoke of burning bodies, creating an atmosphere thick enough to choke on. The Sisters of Battle moved with terrible grace, their bolters barking hymns of their own as they executed survivors with precision and efficiency. They showed no mercy because mercy was weakness, no hesitation because doubt was the path to damnation. Each shot was a prayer, each kill an offering to the Emperor they served with such absolute devotion. I watched from my position, half buried in rubble, as they moved through the wreckage, finishing off anyone who still moved, ensuring that the taint was thoroughly eradicated. Icons were raised against the smoke aquilas of gleaming gold, skulls wreathed in purity seals, banners depicting the Emperor in all his glory. The priests chanted litanies of purification, their voices hoarse from hours of continuous prayer, their eyes bright with the madness of true faith. They declared the manufactorum anathema, pronounced everyone who had participated in the uprising damned beyond redemption, and called down the Emperor's judgment upon our corrupted souls with absolute certainty in their righteousness. I wept, but not for mercy. I had learned that mercy was a fantasy, a concept that had no place in the Imperium's brutal calculus. I wept instead for the meaninglessness of it all, for the understanding that we had never mattered, that our suffering and our rebellion and our deaths were all equally insignificant in the grand scope of the Imperium's endless wars and struggles. We had been born to suffer and die, and that we had chosen the manner of our dying changed nothing about our ultimate irrelevance. The flames found me eventually, as they found everyone. A Sister of Battle, her armor decorated with the fleur-de-lis of the Order of our Martyred Lady, stood over me with her flamer raised. She looked down at me without emotion, without anger or hatred, merely doing her duty as efficiently as she had done it 10,000 times before. When she pulled the trigger, I felt the heat wash over me, felt my flesh begin to blister and burn, felt my hair ignite and my skin blacken. The pain was absolute, beyond anything I had experienced, even in the worst moments of my servitude. Fire consumed me, and I understood why the Imperium chose this method of execution, not merely because it destroyed the body, but because it punished the soul, made death itself an act of prolonged torment that served as both punishment and example. I tried to scream, but my lungs filled with superheated air and my throat burned from the inside. I tried to move, but my muscles contracted and my body curled in on itself like burning parchment. Yet still I lived. Whatever transformation had occurred within me, whatever dark blessing I had accepted, it kept me conscious through horrors that should have killed me instantly. I felt every moment of my immolation, every nerve ending reporting its destruction in exquisite detail, every cell crying out as it was reduced to ash and carbon. The transformation that had granted me strength now became a curse, keeping me alive to experience suffering that should have been mercifully brief. Through the flames, I saw other workers experiencing the same prolonged death, their transformed bodies refusing to die cleanly, instead enduring the purification fire with the same resilience that had allowed them to rise against their masters. The dark powers that had whispered to us had one final gift, the gift of experiencing our punishment fully, of living through our execution, of understanding in our final moments that we had been utterly and completely forsaken. My lungs finally filled with ash, and I began to drown in the products of my own combustion. Still I crawled, driven by some instinct deeper than thought, pulling my ruined body across the wreckage through sheer force of will. Around me, the cleansing continued, thorough and absolute, leaving nothing but ash and fused metal in its wake. The hymns echoed through the manufactorum, praising the Emperor for his mercy, thanking him for the opportunity to serve through purification, celebrating the destruction of heresy with the same joy that others might celebrate creation. I saw a priest raise a massive icon of the Emperor above the burning dead, declaring that their souls would serve him in death as they had failed to serve in life, that their ashes would be mixed with sacred incense and used in future prayers, that even in their damnation they would contribute to the glory of the Imperium. The words were hollow, meaningless, a liturgy of oppression disguised as benediction, but the faithful believed them. I could see it in their eyes, the absolute certainty that what they did was right and necessary and pleasing to the Emperor they served. The Emperor had not saved us. We had prayed to him for years, offered up our suffering as devotion, mouthed his name with every breath, and his answer had been silence followed by fire, abandonment followed by annihilation. The dark powers had promised deliverance and given us only the strength to bring about our own destruction, using our desperation to manifest their corruption before abandoning us to the Imperium's wrath. Both had lied, both had betrayed us, and we had been fools to believe that anything in this galaxy cared about our suffering or our survival. Only the fire remained true. It did not lie or promise or demand worship. It simply consumed, impartial and absolute, reducing everything to ash and heat and light. In my final moments, as my vision failed and my consciousness began to fragment, I found a strange peace in the fire's honesty. It made no claims about serving the greater good, offered no false hope of better things to come. It was what it was: destruction incarnate, the end of all things, the final truth that awaited everything that lived. Through the smoke and flames, I caught one last glimpse of the hive above, its countless levels stretching upward into darkness, each one filled with billions of souls living their own lives of quiet desperation. They would never know what had happened here, would never learn that thousands had risen in rebellion and been crushed with overwhelming force. The administratum would expunge our records, the manufactorum would be rebuilt, new workers would be brought in to replace us, and the machine of the Imperium would continue its inexorable grinding as though we had never existed. I died then, or thought I did, my consciousness flickering out like a candle in a storm. But something kept me from the final darkness, some remnant of the transformation that had touched me, some echo of the powers that had whispered promises in the dark. I floated in a space between death and life, aware but not present, existing but not truly alive. And in that liminal state, I understood that my torment was not over, that the fire had not granted me the release I sought, that I was cursed to continue in some form, some diminished existence, that was neither living nor dead. The cleansing fire burned on, and I burned with it, and the hymns of the faithful echoed through the ruins of the manufactorum like the laughter of cruel gods. We had been slaves to the Imperium, then slaves to the dark powers, and now we would be slaves to our own suffering, trapped in the moment of our death for eternity, unable to move forward or backward, frozen in the instant of our greatest agony. This was the truth we had sought to escape, that in the Imperium even death was not a release but merely another form of service, another way to suffer for the glory of an empire that cared nothing for those who fed its endless appetite. I write this in the ruins, though I no longer possess hands capable of holding a stylus, though my flesh is seared beyond recognition, and my chains have fused to bones that should not still exist. The manufactorum is silent now, the machinery finally stilled, the alarm ceased, the hymns of purification long since faded into memory. In the aftermath of the cleansing, there is only ash and the ghost of what I once was, trapped in this half-existence between life and death, unable to move on, unable to truly end. The fire did not grant me the mercy of oblivion. Instead, it preserved me in this state, this mockery of existence where I retain consciousness but nothing else. I cannot move, cannot speak, cannot interact with the physical world in any meaningful way. I am awareness without agency, consciousness without form, trapped in the ruins of what I was and unable to become anything else. This is the final punishment. I understand now not death, but this endless moment of suffering, this eternal present, where I am forever dying but never dead. There are no overseers now, their bodies long since reduced to ash and scattered by the wind that sometimes howls through the broken sections of the manufactorum. There are no sermons, the priests and zealots having moved on to cleanse other sites of corruption, their work here complete. There is no hope, that concept having been burned away along with my flesh, leaving only the cold certainty that this is all there is, and all there will ever be. The hive above still hums, its billion inhabitants continuing their lives in ignorance of what transpired in the depths. I can hear it sometimes, when the wind carries sound down through the broken levels, the distant roar of machinery, the murmur of countless voices, the eternal song of industry and oppression that defines existence in the Imperium. They live and work and suffer and die, just as I did, caught in the same endless cycle of servitude and torment that has defined human existence since the Emperor first ascended to his golden throne. Perhaps my ashes will mix with the dust they breathe, carried upward by the convection currents and ventilation systems, infiltrating the air supplies of the hab blocks and working their way into countless lungs. Perhaps they will carry my curse with them in silence, spreading the taint of my suffering to those who never knew I existed. Perhaps, in some small way, I will finally achieve what the uprising could not, a revenge so subtle and so slow that no one will ever know it happened. But even that is likely a fantasy, a last desperate attempt to find meaning in meaninglessness, to impose purpose on random suffering. The truth is simpler and more terrible. I am simply here, existing without purpose or meaning, a remnant of a failed rebellion that no one remembers, a casualty of a system so vast and so indifferent that my presence or absence makes no measurable difference to anything or anyone. In the end, I understand what I could not grasp during my time as a slave. Freedom is a heresy in the Imperium because freedom suggests choice, and choice suggests that individuals matter, that their desires and dreams and suffering have weight and significance. But the Imperium is built on the opposite premise that individuals are meaningless except as components in a vast machine, that their value exists only in their utility, that their suffering is irrelevant compared to the needs of the species as a whole. The Emperor sits on his golden throne, neither living nor dead, sustained by the sacrifice of thousands of psychers daily. His consciousness spread across the galaxy in the light of the Astronomicon. In this, he is the perfect embodiment of the Imperium he created, trapped between states, sustained by suffering, existing only to maintain a system that devours everything it touches. We slaves, we workers, we dying masses in the Hive's depths, we are all reflections of him, trapped in our own hells, unable to die, unable to truly live, serving purposes we cannot comprehend and will never benefit from. The only release is oblivion, and I am not yet granted that gift. Perhaps I never will be. Perhaps this is the fate that awaits all who dare to resist, all who question, all who seek to break free from the chains that bind them to the Imperium's infinite hunger, to be trapped forever in the moment of destruction, aware but powerless, conscious but unable to act, existing in an eternal state of suffering that serves as warning and example to any who might follow the same path. The silence of the ashes is absolute. No voices rise from the dead, no ghosts walk through the ruins, no spirits linger to mourn what was lost. There is only me, whatever I am now, alone with my thoughts in a space that exists between worlds, between states, between being and unbeing. I have become what I always was in the Imperium's eyes, nothing. A number, a labor code, a unit of production to be used and discarded without consideration or care. And yet I remain, diminished, destroyed, but not entirely gone. Some part of me persists, holding on to existence with a tenacity I do not understand and cannot control. Whether this is punishment or blessing, whether I am cursed or simply caught in some cosmic accident, I cannot say. I know only that I am here, in the ruins, in the ashes, in the silence that follows annihilation. The Hive above continues its eternal cycle. New workers have already been brought in, I imagine, dragged from their hab cells in the dead hours, just as I was, branded with labor codes and thrown into whatever manufactorum has been built to replace the one that burned. They will suffer as I suffered, break as I broke, and die as I died, their names forgotten, their stories untold, their suffering adding to the vast ocean of misery upon which the Imperium floats. This is the truth that the Imperium cannot acknowledge and will never address, that it is built not on the strength of humanity but on its weakness, not on hope but on despair, not on glory but on an endless grinding horror that consumes billions of lives in service to a cause so vast and so incomprehensible that it might as well not exist at all. The Emperor protects, they say, but from what? From whom? Not from this. Never from this. I write this knowing it will never be read, that no one will ever find these words, that even if they did, they would dismiss them as the ravings of a heretic, the corruption of a tainted soul, the lies of something that should have been destroyed more thoroughly. And perhaps they would be right. Perhaps everything I experienced was simply the working out of my own damnation, the natural consequences of weakness and faithlessness and insufficient devotion to the imperial creed. But I was there. I lived it. I suffered it. And if nothing else, these words are testimony to that suffering, a record that I existed, that I mattered to myself, if to no one else, that my pain was real even if it was irrelevant. Let that be my epitaph, my only monument in a galaxy that will never remember my name. I was here. I suffered. I tried to be free. And I failed, as all must fail who dare to dream of anything better than the endless servitude the Imperium demands. The silence remains. The ashes settle, and I persist in this strange half-existence, trapped forever in the moment of my death, unable to move forward or back, doomed to write words that will never be read in a space that exists nowhere and everywhere. My consciousness spread across the ruins like morning dew, ephemeral and insignificant. This is the end. This is what awaits all who challenge the order of things. Not glorious death in battle, not martyrdom remembered in song, But this slow dissolution into nothing, consciousness preserved, just long enough to understand the totality of failure, to comprehend the insignificance of all struggles against the machine of the Imperium. We are dust, and to dust we return, and even that returning is prolonged beyond all mercy, drawn out into an eternity of awareness without purpose, existence without meaning, suffering without end. The hive hums on. The manufactorum lies silent, and I remain here in the ashes, my story told to no one, my suffering witnessed by none, my existence a footnote that will never be written in the histories of this world. The only truth that remains is the one I learned too late to save me. In the Imperium of Man, there is no escape, there is no freedom, there is only service, suffering, and silence. And I am that silence now, spread across the ruins, mixed with the dust, carried on the wind to places I will never know, to lungs I will never fill, to lives I will never touch. This is my curse. This is my monument. This is all that remains when the fire has burned, and the zealots have moved on, and the machinery of oppression continues its eternal grinding. I am nothing. I am no one. I am forgotten. And still, somehow, impossibly, I endure.